Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rob and today we are going to be painting this Red Corsairs Librarian Sorcerer. Not quite sure, not too au fait with 40k, but a cool model from the Huron Blackheart retinue set that was kindly sent over to me by Crusade again. So I'm looking forward to painting this one. I had originally thought to make it a Sons of Horus character, but then I was kind of looking at the scheme, umming and ahhing about it, and I was like, you know what, let's just do some red. Like, I'd love to get into 40k, do some Red Corsairs. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know, but this is a good little tester. And a tester just, without an airbrush as well. So we're not going to be using an airbrush, we're not going to be using oils. It's just literally speed paint and normal war paint fanatics for this miniature. And again, like the Night Lord that we just did, it was a lot of fun to do. Like just an hour and a half, just sitting down, being absorbed in kind of just one model is pretty cool, and really enjoyed it. So we're going to start off with Blood Moon Red, and then you can also start off with a off-white primer or white primer, whatever works for you guys. And then we're going to use this Blood Moon Red. It's a paint that I use an awful lot. It's pretty similar in tone to Blood Red. If that's more easily accessible. I just like this particular tone. It's kind of a bit orangey and works well with the paints that we're going to be using a little bit later. In terms of what we're doing here, we're just basically filling it in, right? Fill in the numbers, or paint by numbers. And then we're going to apply 2 coats of this paint once it's dry, and you can see here that we have got to kind of a reasonable point where there's fairly good coverage over the model, and then we'll build up on that a little bit later. Next up, for all the black elements, we're going to be using Grim Black, which is again a go-to paint for me, one that I use an awful lot. Again, coverage is really good. I like this for robes and things like that because it just basically, like you'd expect from speed paints, kind of shows off the areas that we should be highlighting a little bit later. There's an awful lot of black on this model. The trim is also black as well, and I think that you guys need to decide things like the ribbing and soft armor joints, whether you'll do those black or whether you'll do them silver. I did the pipes in silver and then the soft armor joints in black. There's quite a lot of black on this model, so just bear that one in mind. Any leather elements, so there's his gloves obviously, and then the strap around his neck, which is holding a chaos sorcerer's icon of some kind. That will also be done with this satchel brown color, which again, if you've seen any of my tutorials before, this is one that I always come back to time and time again for leather. And then we're going to use some paratrooper tan a little bit later, just to do some highlighting with that. But actually, like, you could just leave it like this and it would be pretty well highlighted. For the yellow kind of crotch tabard thing in the middle, we're going to use Sangolem, which is this like bizarre combination of like orange and yellow. Not quite sure what to call it, but having a look at GW's artwork, I was like, you know what, Sand Golem would be a perfect color for this, and indeed it was. So Sand Golem in this one. If you don't have Sand Golem, you could like mix a yellow and an orange together and it'll get you to pretty much to where you want to be. We do have quite a lot of like skulls and stuff on this model, so we need to differentiate the skulls from the parchments, which is all over his cloth. So we use Desolate Brown for the parchments, which is kind of like a greenish kind of, I guess, like skull color. You could use this for skulls as well if you really wanted to. But we just need a bit of differentiation between the two. So just using 2 different color speed paints I think is important here. And then we're going to use Pallid Bone for the for any skulls, of which there are many on this model. This is quite a thin speed paint, and it took me 2 coats to get to where I wanted to be with it, and then I did give it another coat a little bit later of strong tone. We'll get to that in a little bit though, but just bear in mind this is quite a thin speed paint, this one. Maybe I didn't mix it kind of like well enough, but two coats of this will be good. And you can see that there's a difference between the parchments and the bone elements now, which is important. So we've got a little bit of differentiation there. And somebody asked me that actually last month in the Q&A, like how would I go about doing it? And I had thought about this, you know, as I was looking at this model, and here is how. Basically use two different speed paints that are fairly similar in tone, but also slightly different as well. Next up, we are going to do the metallic areas. So in terms of the base coats, it's just a mix of rough iron and greedy gold. The rough iron's there just to give it a little bit bite, just to help it, you know, to help the coverage. Greedy gold is, I would say, not a particularly strong paint if you're just painting it over, you know, white like I would be doing here. So just adding it a bit of rough iron in, it helps to darken it down and just to help the coverage. And then later on I'll just do some highlights with some greedy gold, which I don't actually show you in this video, but it's fairly straightforward. It's just some highlights, you know, rough highlights like dry brushing and stuff like that. But as you can see here, there's not loads of gold on this model, just a few bits and pieces here and there, but just give these a good coat with this colour. Next up, we're going to start tying just the model all together. So we're going to use some strong tone here. This is going to go over the gold elements, this is going to go over the bone elements, and it's going to go over the silver elements as well. The silver was just done with heavy metal, which again, if you've seen any of my tutorials before, this is one that I use kind of like all the time. Just one coat over the model, and just applying this strong tone just to give it a little bit of a kind of like dirty look, and just saves me from using multiple tones. Yeah, strong tone. If you used to use Devlin Mud, which is, if you're a newer hobbyer, then you probably or hobbyists, you probably don't know what I'm talking about, but basically this is the equivalent of kind of like Devlin Mud, right? I did add a little bit of matte varnish into this as well, because I wanted it to be kind of quite matte down. I didn't want any shininess. Right, next up we're going to do some highlights on the black elements now. Now you could, if you wanted to, actually just leave the model here, just do the base and you're basically done, but I wanted to just go to the next step, which is just to add some highlights here. So this is quite a nice, actually, if you're doing fabric and things like that, this is actually quite a nice model to do some kind of like edge highlights with. I don't think it's particularly difficult, and the sculpt is actually quite nice to do. So if you just want to practice, then this might be a good model for you to do. But what you can see me doing here with deep grey is just going around and kind of doing a few edge highlights here and there. Now I've also put on the screen that I've used uniform grey. I did start off with uniform grey, it was too light, went down to deep grey. That was much kind of like much nicer to start with, and then what I will then do is go in with uniform grey, particularly on the corners and the edges, and just kind of further highlight those elements with that uniform grey. So it's very much like an heavy metal style, that, which is that kind of you're working in smaller and smaller bands of kind of like edge highlights there, and then it will just make kind of those edges kind of like pop out even further. You can see on the knee in particular, which is the big highlight there, which is important to do. And yeah, you're just working in smaller and smaller bands of light. And then here we've got Paratrooper Tan, which is an amazing highlight for Satchel Brown. Like if I was to pair these two together, these would be the two that I would pair together, because it just really nicely goes together. The tones fit really, really nicely, and is a really natural one to highlight it with. And then that's all we'll do for the gloves and the for the leather elements on this. But as you can see, it's yeah, it goes really well. I'd love to kind of like spend time matching a speed paint with a Warpaint Fanatic and being like, this is the natural edge highlight. It's a project I've wanted to do for years, but not had a chance to do it. Right, we're going to go on to the red now. So the red, now that everything else is kind of like highlighted around it, looks pretty flat. So we need to do some highlights on this, and we're just going in with some pure fiery vermilion here. And this is a really nice step up from those two coats of that Blood Moon red colour. And then what you can see me doing here is just giving it some rough highlights. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how rough I am being. Like, I have speeded up the video here, but I am being super quick with this, and there's not a lot of red on this model. It's not like we're going for super nice, like, blends on it at all. Like, this is not what I'm doing. I'm actually being really rough. Like, if you saw my Night Lords, the previous Night Lords video tutorial that I've just done, it's exactly the same. I'm using some layering, I'm using some stippling, I'm using some stabbing, you know, into this, just to basically render the highlights on the model, to render the shapes where I think the light is going to be hitting. Now, I have quite a lot of experience with like airbrushing, so I kind of understand like zenithal highlights and things like that. But you can look on the Games Workshop website and kind of be like, okay, how have these guys like highlighted these models, and kind of use that as a reference. And then what I've started to do is add in some Sacred Scarlet into this. Sacred Scarlet is quite a pale colour. It's described as a warm red, but it is quite desaturated. There's quite a lot of you know, ivory in there, or white in there, but it works quite nicely with this. It's quite a good highlight for this, and you can add increasing amounts of Sacred Scarlet into the Fiery Vermilion, and the more that you will add in at each layer, the tighter and tighter you're becoming with your highlight. So you're working in the bands of light that you've created, getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, to be able to create that natural highlight. You can see me here adding more in, and then what I'll do is I'll just do some stippling here. You can just literally see it's just literally stabbing the armor with the paintbrush. It's not, you know, I'm not layering it beautifully, I'm not glazing, none of that. You know, this is not a golden demon piece. This is a quick piece for the tabletop, right? So we don't need to spend loads and loads of time on this, but you can just see, you know, bit of stabbing motion, and then we're getting up to pure Sacred Scarlet here. To get those the armor nicely rendered. And if you want to, you could take it to the next step just by adding a bit of like ivory in, or a bit of that pale bone color, pale sand, which is what I've done here, just as those final top specular highlights. This is actually, again, a really good model to do this kind of thing with, because, you know, because it's the torso, the backpacks, the shoulder pads, which is really just the elements here. You're not having to worry about the shapes of the legs, which is actually quite nice and quite refreshing, because it's covered by cloth. So this is kind of perfect if you wanted to try this kind of like technique for the first time. Right, next up we're going to do some highlights on that cloth now, and we're going to go in with Fiendish Yellow, which again, I didn't know whether this would work, but I think it actually did work quite well for Sand Golem. Again, I'd probably like pair these two as a highlight, and you can just see me here kind of like doing some edge highlights on this, just picking it out. This kind of like flat on the model's left hand side, this flat part, I was like, do I edge highlight it? But I just then decided to just paint it entirely with that that yellow color, kind of like looking at it. I wasn't too sure. A bit of experimentation. It's the first time I painted this model before, so you'll see in a minute. Kind of, I just kind of go over the entire thing on that flat surface, and then we'll do one final highlight with a bit of Fiendish Yellow mixed in with some pale sand. You can see there that I'm just kind of filling that gap in, and then just Fiendish Yellow mixed with some pale sand together, just as some kind of like final highlights on there. Nothing too fancy with this, just kind of like working within the bands of light that I've already created. Again, it's very heavy metal, but you know, again, with a sharp brush and a controlled hand, you know, I do this for a living, so it's easy for me to say, well, just do this, right? You know, it might take some people a little bit longer to kind of like to do this, but you know, again, I cannot emphasize enough, this is just like a tabletop piece. You know, this is not going to be winning any golden demons anytime soon. So the eyes and the kind of like the energy studs, I guess, on the axe are painted. I painted them with that pale sand color again, and then I've just hit them with some Caribbean Ocean, which is a turquoise speed paint. The eyes, I've just gone kind of underneath the eyes as well, just to give kind of like a glowing effect. So you can just hit around there, around the bottom of the eyes, which is nice. And then again, you can hit around the nodes, the energy nodes on that axe as well, just to give the idea that it's glowing. And then go in with some aquamarine, just to do some kind of like final highlights. And then under the actual eye itself, where it's on the armor, you can just highlight with that aquamarine color just to show the light bouncing off the edge of the armor, and then it kind of will make it look like it's glowing. And then I think I just use a dot of pure white here, or that pale sand again. And then that's the kind of like glowing eyes and glowing kind of like nodules done. So next up we are going to do the basing for this model, which is just really simple. We're just going to mix a bit of dark rust enamel liquid pigment with a little bit of light clay, and just thin it with a little bit of white spirits here. I'm just using an upside down base just to mix the two together, and then we'll just apply this over the base. Now in terms of the texture paint, you don't need to worry too much. As long as it's like a dark brown or a black or something like that, that will work kind of well. And then I couldn't be bothered to do the stones. Again, this is like a tabletop paint job, so in this scenario I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna, the rocks and stuff I'll just cover with that kind of like texture paint, the skulls and stuff I'll just cover with the texture paint, and then he'll just be on like a pretty straightforward base. And then what you can see me doing here, once that's dried, is just applying this over the model. They can be quite intense, these liquid pigments, if you don't thin them with a little bit of white spirit. That's the big piece of advice I would give you when using them on a base. But if you're using it for like an OSL effect, you know, they do like fluorescent ones, for example, that intensity is important, so you don't necessarily need to thin it in that scenario. And then that's it. That's the model all finished with the rim done. That is all completed. And this was actually a lot of fun. Like, I enjoyed this an awful lot doing this model. It's a pretty cool model. I think it could be used by loads of the traitor forces for Horus Heresy if you're not using it for 40k. Just a few kind of like changes, changing the axe, changing the head and stuff like that. You can make it for basically any legion. So hope you enjoyed this one. Big thank you to the Army Painter for supporting me with this video, and big thank you to Crusader Games for sending me the Huron's retinue, and a huge massive hugs and kisses to my Patreons. Thank you guys. You obviously get these tutorials early, as well as extra tutorials and Q&As each month as well. And if you haven't checked it out, make sure you do for $3.99 a month. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you got something useful out of it, and I shall see you on the next one.